Do you need to figure out which college admissions test, like the digital SAT or the ACT, you should take? In this video, that's what we're going to explore together. How do we choose? Well, the first thing is you kind of need to understand how each test is structured and formatted. So let's talk about the ACT and the digital SAT in general. ACT first. So some general things about the ACT is that it is entirely multiple choice. It's broken down into 4 sections. We have English, then math, then reading, then science. There is, yes, an optional essay that you could do, but honestly, no college in the US even requires it anymore, so I often tell my own students to not even bother. The ACT is also analog. It's a paper pencil test, like you're actually bubbling in answer sheets. And also, you should know that the sections are all scored between 1 and 36. So yes, a perfect score is not an 800, it's a 36. So each section, you can get up to 36 points, and then to get your final ACT score, you would average those 4 section scores. So again, your final composite would be as low as 1 up to a perfect 36. Now let's talk about what these sections are. So as I mentioned, the first one is the English section, also known as grammar. And basically this one has a lot of questions in it, 75 questions, and you have 45 minutes to do it. But the way it really works is it's broken down into 5 passages. So 5 passages, each one has 15 questions, and you're basically, there are 15 multiple choice questions that are asking you to make edits to the passage. So then you've got the math section. So that one is 60 questions in 60 minutes. It's all multiple choice. Yeah, some of them are easier and then they get harder. You don't have a reference sheet, so all of those geometry formulas need to be securely memorized in that brain of yours. But you do get to use your calculator for the entire thing, so that's great. The reading section is the 3rd section on the test, and it's shorter than the others. It's 35 minutes, and you only have 40 questions. But once we break down what that looks like, it's beneficial for some and not others. So those 40 questions, that's broken down into 4 different passages. So we have a fiction passage, a social science, a humanities, a natural science, always in that order. We have a passage with 10 accompanying questions. So if you do the math, you're answering one of those passages and it's 10 questions in roughly 8 minutes, 45 seconds on average to finish in time. Also, you should note one of those passages, and we will never know which one, it's different on every test, will be what we call a paired passage. So instead of one full-length passage, it'll be like one column will be called passage A, one column will be called passage B, and you might answer some questions about the first one, you'll answer some questions about the second, and then you'll answer some questions about the 2 and how they relate to each other. Finally, we have the 4th section, which is the science section. The science section of the test is also 40 questions in 35 minutes. And it's also broken down into passages. Specifically, it's broken down into 6 passages of 3 different types. So we've got 3 experiment passages. Each of those have 7 questions. We have 2 chart and graph passages. Each of those have only 6 questions apiece. And then we have one that I lovingly call the fighting scientist, or you could call it the conflicting scientific viewpoint passage. That one is 7 questions. So 6 passages for these 35 minutes. It's roughly 5 minutes, 50 seconds a passage. Let's talk about the digital SAT and its general format. The digital SAT only has 2 sections, but each of those sections are farther broken down into 2 modules apiece. So we've got the reading and writing section with its 2 modules, and then we've got the math section with its 2 modules. One of the biggest things is that the digital SAT, as its name implies, is digital. You take it on a computer or a laptop or a tablet, and there's a specific app called the Blue Book app that you will have downloaded ahead of time on your device. What that means is there's no number 2 pencils and bubbling. You're actually clicking your answer choice, and you can actually go back, you can mark a question for review, you can use your mouse to annotate or highlight something on the screen. It's interesting. It's a different experience than what you might be used to. The other part of it is, since it is on the computer, there is another curveball with this test, and that is it is computer adaptive. And what does that mean? So computer adaptive means that some of the questions that you get are dependent on how well you performed on previous questions. And different tests out there in the world do this in different ways. This one does it in a very specific way, right? So remember how I said each of those sections is actually broken down into 2 what I call modules? Well, that's exactly what happens. So however you perform on the first module, that will determine if you get an easier or a harder set of questions for the second module within that section. Another thing about the digital SAT is that every question on it is discrete in all the sections. Like there's no passage that you read for 10 questions. It's like every question has its own text. So if you miss number 13, it has no bearings on your ability to understand what's going on and answer question 14 correctly. Now, scoring for the digital SAT. So each section is scored between a 200 and an 800. So 800 would be perfect. 200 would be you didn't answer anything. So then what we do is we add the section scores together. So we have up to 800 possible points in reading, writing. We have up to 800 possible points in math, and we add those so that your total score could be as high as a perfect 1600. So now let's actually break down what the reading and writing section and what the math section looks like. The reading and writing section of the digital SAT is broken down, remember, into those 2 modules. So each one is 27 questions that you have 32 minutes to do. That first module will be a mix of easy, medium, and hard questions. Depending on how many you get right and how the computer assesses your skill level, you will either get an easier second module or a harder second module. When we do the calculations of how much time, you actually get about 71 seconds per question for the reading and writing section. So the math section for the digital SAT, it's also broken down into 2 modules, but there's only 22 questions in each, and you get 35 minutes to do them in. So again, the first half, the first module, you have 35 minutes to answer 22 questions. It's a mix of easy, medium, and hard math questions. Then, depending on how you do, you will either get an easier or a harder second module, which is the same length. It's 22 questions, again, in 35 minutes. Within these 2 modules in the math section, you will have a mix of multiple choice and self-produced answers. So what that means is that 3/4 of these questions will be a simple multiple choice, like answers A, B, C, or D. About 11 of the questions, or 1/4 of them, they will be ones where you don't have options to choose from. You actually have to calculate it on your own and then type in your answer. It could be a fraction, it could be a decimal, it could be an integer, it could be negative. So it's kind of like infinite possibilities of what you could type in. Also, something to note is that with the digital SAT's math section, you are allowed to bring a handheld calculator if you like, but there's also a built-in calculator into the testing app. I mean, yes, you have to use your mouse or trackpad to click to, enter in the numbers. That's fine. You have one there. You can also bring the one you're used to. There is also a reference table. So if you need those geometry formulas, you have them right there in the app. So hey there, I'm Kristina of Ivy Lounge Test Prep. I help high schoolers all over the globe get into their dream colleges by helping them drastically raise their SAT and ACT test scores and write compelling college application essays. I want to know, do you already have an idea of which test, ACT or digital SAT, you should take? Like maybe one sounding better to you so far? So make sure to tell me below in the comments. And while you're at it, could you just hit that little subscribe button and click that nice little thumbs up sign? Thank you. Now that you understand the basic lay of the ACT and digital SAT lands, you're probably noticing that these tests seem pretty darn different. And you know what? You're absolutely right. These tests are entirely different species from one another as far as I'm concerned. Now, I've done the work for you to highlight what I think the main differences are between these tests. And where I can, I'm going to try and explain like how that might benefit or be a disservice to certain types of test takers. So these might not be all the differences between the tests, but these are the main ones as I see it as a test prep expert. Let's talk basic test format here. The ACT is analog. You're bubbling with your number 2 pencil. The digital SAT is on a computer and it's computer adaptive. That's a big difference. If you're one of those people who, like, when you read a reading passage, you really need to be like underlining things and circling things, you might like the ACT because you can do that. Like, sure, on the app that you would be taking the digital SAT on, yes, there is a way to highlight and annotate and make your notes, but I find it kind of time consuming. Maybe you can hack it, but I personally find it a little bit tedious and it almost takes more time than it saves for me. Yes, you can always bring your own pieces of scratch paper and paper or pencil to make your own notes. That's totally allowed. But again, if you're reading, like, I'm specifically thinking of the reading and writing sections here, like when you're reading a text, you know, it's hard to like underline something when that something is on the screen. Okay, now let's talk overall timing of the 2 tests. This is another big difference. So the ACT is like 41 more minutes of taking a test than the digital SAT is. So it's 2 hours, 55 minutes long. And then the moment you add breaks, it's over 3 hours. The digital SAT comes in much shorter at 2 hours, 14 minutes. So if you're a person who like cannot sit still for very long, you know, you might like the shorter testing time of the digital SAT. Also concerning time, let's talk about the timing of individual questions, right? You just have more time per question on the digital SAT, plain and simple. So on the ACT, you have an average, like across the whole test, of 49 seconds per question. And yes, this ranges a lot. As low as 36 seconds for a question on English, as high as 60 seconds or a full minute per question in math. And in between there, like 52.5 seconds per question on reading and science. On the digital SAT, on the other hand, you have roughly 82 seconds per question. I mean, as low as 71 seconds for reading, writing per question, and but then you get like 95 seconds, which is over a minute and a half for each math question. So that averages to roughly 82 seconds or a minute 22 per question. Significantly more time for the digital SAT. Another huge difference, and honestly to me this is like the biggest difference, the reading and writing for the digital SAT could not be more different than the English and reading sections for the ACT. Let's talk about the reading first though. On the ACT, you remember how it was just 4 passages and each one had 10 questions? Now these passages weren't particularly hard. They kind of are the level of difficulty of like, you know, informative, helpful blog post you might find on the internet somewhere. None of them were written in the 1800s. It's not super old English or super historical or anything. They tend to be more modern. They tend to be pretty accessible. The questions tend to be straightforward, right? And yeah, sure, they'll ask you things about what you're reading as well as things about how the author wrote what he or she did. Like they might ask you about the structure or the function or the purpose of something, but then they'll also ask you just things you can find in the text, like which flower did the author find when she was walking down the field, like literally details. Or it might ask you a main idea, or it might ask you, you know, what does the word form mean in line 17? They're pretty straightforward questions and texts. It's just you don't have a lot of time to get them done. Again, if you're a regular time test taker, it's 8 minutes 45 seconds per passage and all of its questions. Let's talk about what the digital SAT does instead. So on the digital SAT, first of all, reading and writing are all smushed together within one section. But the reading questions that are in that section are very different. You don't have long texts with several questions attached. So like in other words, you can't like invest in a passage and like, now that I understand what it means, I can quickly answer all of those questions. None of that. They're all what we call discrete questions. So every question has its own text, usually about a paragraph, sometimes 2 paragraphs, and it will ask you something about them. Yeah, a lot of those do I understand what I read type of questions, those are the same on both tests, like what is the main idea, or what is true about, like a detail question, or what is the function of the sentence, or what was the purpose. A lot of those carry over. It's just on the digital SAT, each of those questions has its own text. And then the very next question, you're reading a totally different paragraph or 2 about something totally different and you're answering a different question. But then the other big part of it is that's only like some of the reading questions. We have 2 other main types of reading questions. We have a significant amount of what I call sentence completions, which are basically vocabulary questions. We have a text, and then there's an underline, and it asks you which of the 4 vocab words makes the most sense in that underline. So this is directly testing your vocabulary and also sentence logic and word logic. Less about, do I comprehend what I read? We also have another type of question that you don't see on the ACT, and these all have to do with logic, right? So I actually think that this group of questions I'm going to talk about, to me, it resembles the critical reasoning questions that you would find on the GMAT to go to business school. Like they're that advanced. And they have to do with claims. Like, yes, there's a little passage. Which one of the following would weaken the author's claim, would strengthen the author's claim? According to the text and this chart or this graph, which of the following would best complete the example or illustrate the example or weaken the claim from the passage? So it has to do with logic and synthesizing information. And some might be text only, some might have some infographics to look at too. And so that is a totally different question type that requires a very nuanced, sophisticated level of reading. The other thing I want to mention as a huge difference between the reading on the ACT and the digital SAT is that, these little short passages that are 1 or 2 paragraphs a piece, a lot of them are pretty sophisticated. Like some of them can be fairly difficult. They're way more difficult passages, I would say, than the like friendly blog post style of reading passage you'd find on the ACT. That said, you do get more time for the ones on the digital SAT. And if you didn't understand that one passage, great, it only affects that one question. Move on. The next one, it will be a totally different paragraph for you to read. So that discreteness of the questions might be a plus. It might not be a plus for you. You might get tired of switching from topic to topic. So that's kind of the thing. I would say that if you have a more sophisticated reading level and you could read more complicated, even older texts, you're very good with vocab, logic, but you need your time, digital SAT might be more up your alley. If you're more of a straight shooter and you know what you read, but maybe you don't go perhaps as deep with it as some of your classmates do, but you're quick, the ACT might be better for you. Now let's talk about the writing versus English. So this is basically grammar and how both tests effectively test this skill, right? So on the digital SAT, we have the, last half of each module will be grammar and some rhetorical strategies questions, which have to do with writing. And then, of course, on the ACT, we have an entirely separate section, the first section, the English section, right? And that's what tests your grammar. Grammar rules themselves on both tests are the same. Like the punctuation, subject, verb agreement, parallelism, modifiers, pronouns, transition words, all of that good stuff you need to know, that's the same. Like you need to know it for both tests. Where the two tests really differ is in what we call like rhetorical strategies, like, well, how should the author put this together, right? Where it's more subjective, it's less rules-based. The ACT has several question types that, I've talked about actually in many of my old blog posts. So one is like, oh, the author's thinking of adding the sentence here, should he or shouldn't he? Or, where should we put sentence number 4 so that it makes the most sense? Or, if the writer were talking about dog training in general, would this essay have fulfilled that purpose? Why or why not? So they're questions having to do with the piece as a whole and the meaning and the purpose and kind of like the craft of writing itself. But we don't have questions like that on the digital SAT. Instead, it's like they replaced all of the rhetorical strategy questions with a new type of question, which is basically, I nickname the research notes question. So you have basically there's a student, a hypothetical student, and they've written some notes and done some research on a topic. And then the question will say something along the lines of, based on the notes, complete the text in a way that, and it'll give you a specific task, like emphasizes the origin of the artist and how that contributed to her work, or something like that. It'll give you something specific, but you have to look at the notes and then pick the sentence that does that task, but does it factually based on the research that the student has already done. So totally new question type, not necessarily hard, but just different. And now let's just talk about the math on the two tests and how that is different. One biggie, on the digital SAT, a fourth of those questions are going to be self-produced, meaning you don't get to plug in answers because there are no answer choices. It's not multiple choice. You have to whip that answer out of thin air, like actually solve the problem. And guessing will be significantly harder because there are so many possible answers one could guess. Now on the ACT, it's all multiple choice, right? So if you're one of those people who really uses the answers and you back solve and you plug in answer choices instead of solving questions, you might like the ACT because all of it is multiple choice, just saying. But not the end of the world. If you can actually do the math, then you can do the digital SAT as well. Another difference is if you're one of those people who does not remember your, geometry at all, this affects you in two ways. So on the ACT, geometry is roughly a fourth of the test questions. And moreover, there's no reference sheet. So you actually need to know those special right triangles or how to find the volume of the prism. You can't look on the reference sheet because there is none. Now on the digital SAT, you do get a reference sheet, and also there's much less geometry. So geometry and trig clock in at under 15%, about 15% of the digital SAT content. So, but that's geometry and trig. So geometry is probably roughly 10% of the overall test. So again, like a fourth of the test versus closer to an eighth or a tenth of the test, right? So if you're strong in geometry, ACT might be better for you. If you're less strong in geometry, the digital SAT might be better for you. I know we've gone through the weeds. We have dissected the formats of the two tests, the digital SAT and the ACT. We've looked at the main differences between the two. We can abstractly examine these tests all we want, but you know what? You're not gonna really understand what they're like unless you actually take a timed diagnostic test of each of them and compare them. When you take any diagnostic test, you wanna do it timed. You want to do it in testing conditions. You're going to pretend like it's a real testing environment. Ideally, you do it in the morning because morning is when you'd be taking the ACT or real digital SAT. You would do it with no distractions, no phone, no food, no music playing in the background. Make sense? We want it to be as real as possible. If we could even make you feel a little nervous by making it feel so real, that would even be a plus. For your diagnostic ACT, you're going to print out the official real past ACT from the ACT's website. Now, I've included the link to that as well as timing and instructions on my website's diagnostic testing page for your convenience. So I'm going to link to my diagnostic testing page and it'll have the instructions as well as the link to the test on the ACT's website. For the digital SAT, you have two options, which you'll also see on my diagnostic testing page. You can download the Bluebook app, right? And you could do the first official digital SAT practice test on Bluebook. This does require making yourself a College Board account and requires downloading the app. But then once you've done that, like it times you, right? The actual Bluebook app will time you with the test. So that's one option. The other option, let's say you don't want to download anything or you don't have, access to a device that will let you do that, you can take what we call a linear, non-adaptive paper version of the new digital SAT. And I'm going to link to an official one of those as well in my diagnostic testing page. So warning, if you do the paper version, it will be a little bit longer, right? So since it's not adaptive, it actually does need to ask you more questions to assess your skill level. But I mean, the good news is that you don't have to download an app. You don't need a device if you don't have access to one. So those are your options. So go to my diagnostic test page in the notes for instructions and links to the tests and go take your tests. Okay. So let's say you've taken your two diagnostic tests. How do you now actually choose between them? After you've tried both tests, you will know, like a feeling in your body, you will know right away which test you like more. You might even have, I jokingly say, an allergic reaction to the other test. Other times, maybe you were fine, you didn't hate either one, but oh my goodness, your score on one was comparatively so much higher than your score on the other. Well, then that might be pretty clear that you're going to do the one that you score so significantly better on, because that means, there's less work you need to do to improve to get to that illustrious median 50% range for your dream school. Other times, the test chooses you. Let's say you require accommodations or you require extra time. And these two tests come from two different companies. Like the digital SAT is a College Board thing. It's owned and operated by the College Board. The ACT is owned by the ACT organization. Those are two different companies. So if you were to apply to get your accommodations or your extended time for one and it denies you, but then you apply to the other company and it grants you the time you need, the test kind of chose you in that instance, right? Because if you need accommodations or you need extra time, I think you're probably better off going with the test that gave you the extra time and accommodations that you require. A lot of times it's not so clear cut, right? Your scores are close. And what might be even more confusing is maybe the type of questions you missed on one test are things that can be real easily improved, like just learn a rule or a formula or a strategy, and now you'll get those right. But maybe the things you missed on the other test are the type of things that you can't really easily improve. It's like one of those you have it or you don't kind of things. So what do you do in that case? A test prep expert like me can discern which type of questions you can improve and which ones you can't, which means that we can actually get to the bottom of which test is ultimately going to be more improvable for you, regardless of where you are right now. So do you want to find out exactly which test shows off your strengths better and then how to ace it? So this is exactly what I do in my Ace the Test game plan session when you become my one-on-one client. So all you have to do are take two diagnostic tests. Take your diagnostic ACT, your diagnostic digital SAT, as well as come up with a list of approximately, 5+ schools that you might want to apply to. Even a completely preliminary list that you're starting to consider is totally fine. Then what we do is we meet on Zoom a few days later for our Ace the Test game plan. It would be you, your parents, and me, and then I take care of the rest. By the end of our time together, our roughly hour and a half together, we'll know exactly which test is more improvable for you and shows off your strengths better. We'll know the target scores we need to aim for to open the door to your dream schools. And we'll know when you should take your first attempt at the test, as well as which backup test dates make the most sense according to, your schedule, like your academic and extracurricular calendar. But more importantly than any of that is that you'll know exactly which concepts and strategies you need to learn to get from the score you have now to your target scores. Your whole junior year and even summer between junior and senior years will be mapped out for you. Then it's just a matter of you implementing the plan with private tutoring sessions with me, or you can do it on your own, or you could even use some of my ebooks and courses. So if this sounds like a fit for you, then book your Ace the Test game plan session with the link below in the notes. And do you still have questions? Then please book a call to talk to me to find out if an Ace the Test game plan and a tutoring package is right for you.